The world is going through some unprecedented economic times where we are seeing a manufacturing slowdown, business closures, and an unemployment crisis. But hidden in the shadows is another massive economic problem. A problem that hasn't been seen in nearly 100 years and has been known to cause the downward spiral of some of the most powerful economies in history. And this is a problem that most people have never heard of. If you wanted to buy something like bread, what would you do? Well, these days you would probably just go to the local grocery store, pick out some bread, and pay with your card, cash, or phone. But buying bread wasn't always this simple. A few thousand years ago, if you wanted to buy something like grain, you would have to give up something in return like sheep. This was called the barter system, and it is how humans used to trade goods before the invention of currency. But this barter system had a deep economic inefficiency. For example, what if the person with grain did not want any sheep? Even though to most people at the time the grain and sheep would have equal value, if the grain owner simply did not want any sheep, then the trade would not happen. Problems like this are why ancient civilizations in Egypt, Babylon, India, and China came up with a game-changing idea that the world still uses today. They started using clay tokens that could be redeemed at any local warehouse for a select quantity of items, meaning that these clay tokens had value that could be traded at markets instead of having to use the barter system. And this was the invention of modern-day currency. But with the invention of currency came a new kind of crisis that the world had never seen before. The Roman Empire in the 3rd century AD had the world's most advanced banking system that relied heavily upon its currency and coinage. But during this time, a familiar series of events led to the destruction of its financial system. The first of which was that the Mediterranean began running out of silver, which was an important resource for the Roman economy and was what Roman currency was dependent upon. The second event was that economic growth of the Roman Empire slowed down for several decades, and the third event was that the empire began producing more coins and making more of its own currency in order to try and help with its state finances. The trouble was that once they started overproducing their currency, they began to devalue that currency. So by about 284 AD, the Roman Empire was going through the first recorded episode of what we know today as hyperinflation. Now, this hyperinflation caused a dramatic decrease in the value of the Roman currency. It increased the price of all goods within the Roman Empire on nearly a daily basis, and it also brought a large portion of the middle class into poverty. So this hyperinflation, combined with the economic decline, as well as several wars that were taking place, these events became known as the crisis of the 3rd century. This century is viewed by many historians as the beginning of the fall of the Roman Empire. Now remember what I just said, the overproduction of Roman currency to combat state spending was one of the largest contributors as to why the Roman Empire fell. So that brings us to today. We are currently facing a crisis in which governments around the world are printing trillions of dollars in order to help combat the effects of the lockdowns. Now, many people have feared that this overproduction of currency will lead to high inflation or even hyperinflation, which would likely catapult the middle class of many countries around the world into poverty, just like what happened in the Roman Empire. However, despite most countries around the world overprinting their currency, we actually haven't seen any inflation at all. In fact, most countries around the world are going through a currency problem which might actually be worse. You see, in the early 1930s, during the worst parts of the Great Depression, most people would have expected to see some sort of high inflation or even hyperinflation, which is what typically occurs during bad economic times. But what we actually saw was the exact opposite. During the Great Depression, we saw an example of what is called deflation. You see, the Great Depression caused such a bad economic crisis that the demand for cash dramatically exceeded the government's ability to increase the money supply. So what we saw was the value of the United States currency actually increase by 10% per year over 3 years thanks to this deflation. Now, on the surface, this might sound great. I mean, the buying power of your money actually increases during deflation, so how could this be a bad thing? Well, here's why. You see, deflation increases the value of everything revolving around a currency. As I already mentioned, the positives are that the current money in the economy has more buying power, but it also increases the real value of debt. Now, as I mentioned in my previous videos, debt is at an all-time high for businesses, individuals, and governments around the world. I mean, governments have already taken out over $16 trillion worth of debt in the last 2 months alone, and are adding to the debt pile at a rate that is 10 times higher than normal. So what this means is that anyone with debt, whether it's governments who are at risk of defaulting on their loans, businesses who are months away from not being able to make a payment, or individuals who are behind on their mortgages, credit cards, or student loans, they actually will have a higher debt burden thanks to deflation. So we are currently in an era where the world is at an all-time high in regards to its debt burden, and that debt is actually being amplified by this deflation that has started just a couple months ago. For example, major economies like the European Union, the United States, and the UK will likely enter a state of deflation within the next 2 to 3 weeks. Large countries like China and Brazil could enter a state of deflation within the next couple months, and nations like Canada, Japan, and South Korea have already entered a state of deflation. And this might be particularly bad for Japan and Canada. You see, Japan is already the most indebted nation in the world in relation to its GDP, and Ontario, which is the largest province in Canada, is the largest sub-sovereign debtor in the world. In fact, if Ontario were a country, it would have the 28th largest amount of debt in the world, ahead of countries like Ireland, Saudi Arabia, Argentina, South Africa, and the United Arab Emirates. What this means is that places that already have a high debt burden and go through major deflation are also at risk for going through a very rare economic crisis called a deflationary spiral. So remember when I mentioned that the Great Depression had 3 years of deflation? Well, as it turns out, a deflationary spiral occurred during that time, and well, here's what happened. Deflation caused the price of goods to fall. The price of goods falling made businesses make less money. Businesses making less money caused mass layoffs and decreased wages. The layoffs and decreases in wages caused less spending and therefore made businesses make less money. And that caused more layoffs and lower wages and so on. This cycle continued until the global economy entered its worst point in history in the mid-1930s. So the deflationary spiral of the Great Depression ended up deepening and accelerating the negative economic effects of the Great Depression, and that is what could potentially happen during this crisis. You see, as of right now, the current deflationary levels of every major country in the world is relatively okay and won't cause a deflationary spiral or a currency crisis. However, deflation has been rapidly increasing for several months now, so it might be possible that if deflation were to continue to increase for the next 3 to 6 months, we could see some countries go through a deflationary spiral that has not been seen since the Great Depression. So even though many people view high inflation as the enemy of an economy, a much less common enemy of the economy is on the horizon, and yet no one is really talking about this. So if deflation were to continue to increase, we will likely see a much worse economic crisis than what we are currently experiencing right now. And this is especially true for those countries with high debt burdens. So what do you think of all of this? Do you think deflation will be a problem? And what about inflation or a currency crisis? Let me know in the comments down below. Also, please hit that like and subscribe button, that helps me out a ton, and make sure to check out my documentaries playlist on my channel, as that is where I have a ton of other videos just like this on there. So make sure to click on that playlist or another one of my videos, and I will see you guys in that video in just a few seconds.